Free speech is foundational to our Constitution. The First Amendment in the Bill of Rights begins by protecting our rights to free speech, and our democratic processes depend upon robust free speech. Speech with which we agree and speech with which we disagree. The marketplace of ideas. Since the beginning of journalism, there has been bias in the media. From the first journalist carving on stone tablets, media bias and bias of human beings has been a fact of life. But today we face an altogether different threat. The power of big tech is something that William Randolph Hearst, at the height of yellow journalism, could not have imagined. In particular, what makes the threat of political censorship so problematic is the lack of transparency, the invisibility, the ability for a handful of giant tech companies to decide if a particular speaker is disfavored, that he or she may speak and their words simply fade into the ether, that no one hears what they say and nobody knows that no one hears what they say. Not only does big tech have the power to silence voices with which they disagree, but big tech likewise has the power to collate a person's feed so that they only receive the news that comports with their own political agenda. Polling shows roughly 70% of Americans receive their political news from social media. That power is enormous. And I will tell you, in traveling the state of Texas and traveling the country, over and over again, I've heard from Americans concerned about a consistent pattern of political bias and censorship on the part of big tech. Big tech enjoys a special immunity from liability under what's called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Now, a great many people agree that the pattern, the anti-conservative bias and the pattern of censorship we're seeing from big tech is concerning. The question of remedy is a more complicated one. What to do about it is a thorny question. It's a thorny legal question. It's a thorny policy question. Nobody, or at least nobody in their right mind, wants to see a government speech police. No one wants to see the federal government regulating what is allowed to be said. But there are at least three potential remedies that can be considered either by Congress or the administration or both. The first I mentioned is Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. That provides a special immunity from liability that big tech enjoys that nobody else gets. The predicate for that immunity from liability is that the social media platforms were understood to be neutral public fora. In other words, they were simply posting what others said. They weren't engaging in their own political advocacy. Now, I will note some commentators have misunderstood the argument I'm making in this, in that they've suggested that I'm arguing that Section 230 requires in its statutory text that big tech companies be neutral public fora. That's not my argument. My argument is that big tech made effectively a bargain with Congress and a bargain with the American people. We'll be neutral, we'll be fair, we won't be biased, and in exchange for that, we'll receive what is effectively a federal subsidy of immunity for liability. If big tech wants to be partisan political speakers, it has that right. But it has no entitlement to a special immunity from liability under Section 230 that the New York Times doesn't enjoy, that the Washington Post doesn't enjoy, that nobody else enjoys other than big tech. The second potential avenue for remedy is the antitrust laws. Applying the antitrust laws in this area is complicated. But by almost any measure, the giant tech companies today are larger and more powerful than Standard Oil was when it was broken up. They're larger and more powerful than AT&T was when it was broken up. And if we have tech companies using the powers of monopoly to censor political speech, I think that raises real antitrust issues. The third potential avenue of remedy is under principles of fraud. Most users of Facebook or Twitter or Google, when they use those services, they don't envision that they're participating in a biased forum. They believe that when they speak, the people who've chosen to follow them will hear what they say. And there are distressing pieces of evidence that suggest that's not the case. Now, I will note, much of the argument in this topic is anecdotal. It's based on one example or another example. There's a reason for that, because we have no data. There is no transparency. Nobody knows how many speakers Twitter is blocking, how many speakers Facebook is blocking. Nobody knows what the raw data is in terms of bias. So one of the first things that this hearing seeks to accomplish is simply move us towards transparency, to understand what the facts are. Argument by anecdote is less than satisfying, but it is all we are left with as long as big tech remains a black box that simply says, trust us. Senator Hirono.